A common theme with Deleuze here is the conceptual priority of difference over identity. I think that identity is a derived concept, and not a primitive one. If you look at Aristotle, for example, he doesn't take identity to be, something that's primitive. In the same way, I don't think that Aristotle thinks Plato, and Plato alike, I don't think they think identity is primitive. I think they both think it's derived. And the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, in Difference and Repetition, and many other works, argue that the pure notion of difference is by itself sufficient for a general account of things. In information theory, information is explained as expressing difference. In Saussurean structural linguistics, we are set to recognize spoken words by recognizing elementary differences between sounds. So in both cases, the idea that we get to meaning by distinguishing and relating. Now, Deleuze initially cites both of these notions of difference, but he goes on to develop arguments grounded largely in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, whom he uses to argue against Plato and Hegel. His very interesting early work, Nietzsche and Philosophy, was marred by a rather extreme polemic against Hegel, and in Difference and Repetition he announces a program of anti-Platonism that reproduces Nietzsche's intemperate hostility towards Plato. Now, Nietzsche blamed Plato for what I regard as later developments. Now, neither Plato nor Aristotle made the kind of overly strong assertions about identity that became common later on. In The Sophist and elsewhere, Plato had his characters speak of the same and the other, and the mixing of the two was equally primordial. Hegel took great pains to elaborate on the notion of difference that makes a difference, but Deleuze wants to argue that Plato and Hegel both illegitimately subordinate difference to identity. And his alternative is to argue what is truly fundamental is a primitive notion of difference that does not necessarily make a difference, and that comes before anything, or any making of a difference. Now, I prefer the thesis of Leibniz that indiscernibility of any difference is just what identity consists in. Now, this is related to Deleuze in his very questionable use of Duns Scotus and his notion of univocity of being, both in general and more particular in his interpretation of Spinoza. Because for Deleuze, pure difference interprets Scotus' univocal being. I kind of have no idea really what led to Deleuze's valorization of Scotus, because Deleuze is quite an extreme opposition to any kind of representationalism, while Scotus made representability the defining criterion of his kind of newly invented univocal being. And it's quite hard to imagine the types of views that are further apart. I can only speculate that Deleuze too hastily picked out Scotus because he wanted to provocatively oppose the 20th century neo-Thomists that had been considerably big and had a lot of prominence in France at the time, and Scotus was a leading medieval figure standing outside of the Thomist tradition. Now, for Deleuze, univocal being is pure difference without identity. Now, difference that doesn't make a difference seems to take over the functional role that identity has in theories that treat as something underlying that exceeds any discernibility based on criteria. Now, and I don't see why we really need any of these. I think Deleuze and his Bête Noire Hegel actually did a better job of articulating the priority of difference over identity. Hegel did this not by appealing to a putative monism of difference and nothing else, but by developing correlative notions of difference that makes a difference, and a kind of logical consequence or an entailment that we attribute to real things as we interpret them, independent and prior to any elaboration of the logic in a formal sense. In Hegel's analysis, as explicated by Brandom, any difference that makes a difference expresses a kind of material incompatibility of meaning that rules out some possible assertions. And this is just what makes a difference, or making a difference, means. While, all the positive assertions can be more specifically analysed as assertions of some consequence, or entailment, or another level of meaning, right? Now, every predication is analysable as an assertion of consequence or an entailment between subject and predicate, as Leibniz might remind us. It is always valid to interpret, something like a cat is a mammal, as an inference rule for generating conclusions, like if Garfield is a cat, then Garfield is a mammal. Now, what is missing from Deleuze's account is anything like entailment, the idea of something following from something else. This notion of following, I'm quite convinced at least, is prior to any notion of identity applicable to real things. Without supposing any pre-existing identities things, we can build up an account of the world based on the combination of differences that make a difference. On the one hand, a real-world entailment, and on the other, we kind of have identity and how it's actually a result rather than an assumption. Meanings, and anything like identity emerge from the interplay of practical world engagements, and entailments and distinctions. It's their interplay that gives them their definition in terms of one another, and this is very Hegelian, and Aristotle would agree. Now, there's a point where Aristotle would say, yes, it is, what gives them their identity, but it's more that he's bothered about it gives them their identity qua us being able to define them, right? We wouldn't be able to define them if they weren't, distinct, right? If there weren't distinctions between things, if there wasn't, discernibility between objects, qua, materia quantity at the transcendental level. Now, Deleuze was a sort of ontological anarchist, and he wanted to, being to be free of any pre-existing principles. Now, I agree that we can't legitimately just assume such principles, and I think this is very far from meaning that principles are irrelevant or actually harmful. On the contrary, as Kant might remind us, principles are all important, right? They aren't just given, right? We have to do the actual work to develop them. And we kind of have to ask the hermeneutical questions like Adama and Kant want to ask, right? But if we have no principles, if nothing truly follows from anything else or, is ruled out by anything else, then, we can't really meaningfully say anything whatsoever at all. Now, to give the scholastic critique, or the kind of showing how St. Thomas kind of schools, Deleuze on this idea, right, and how he actually gets it wrong, right, is that when we read Book 1, Lectio 4, paragraphs 46 and 47 of St. Thomas Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, right, we actually see Aquinas is discussing Aristotle's summary on Plato's Timaeus, where Aristotle reports that Plato constructed the soul out of the first principles. Now, Aquinas says this: the first is from the Timaeus, where Plato says that there are two elements or first principles, identity and difference. For there is a certain kind of nature that is simple and unchanging, as are immaterial things. And this nature he calls identity. And there is another kind which does not stay the same, but undergoes change and division, as do material things. And this nature he calls difference. And it is of these two principles, of identity and difference, that the soul is composed. Now, Aquinas goes on to explain the epistemological kind of question, or kind of answer. When it gathers things together under genera and species, then said Plato, it manifests sameness or identity. But when it attends to accidents and differentiations, he finds it in difference. Now, Aquinas is reporting rather, than simply endorsing the Platonic position, that he follows Aristotle in ultimately rejecting the soul's composition from these principles as an element theory that confuses knowing with material constitution. But the passage is very significant beyond merely it reporting, right? Because Aquinas affirms through his commentary something that neither he nor Aristotle disputes, that identity and difference are, in a way, co-principles of intelligible reality. Neither have priority over the other, they are correlative. The soul knows identity when it grasps universal natures under genera and species, and it knows difference when it grasps accidents, and the individuating factors, and the material variation. Now, neither mode of knowing is reducible to the other, and neither is ontologically more primitive than the other. Reality as it presents itself to rational cognition is never purely identical or purely different, and every act of knowing involves both, grasping something as this kind of thing, right, identity under form, and as distinct from other things, difference through individuating or accidental characteristics. Identity and difference co-constitute the intelligible structure of being, and to separate them, to make one prior to the other, is not to reveal a deeper level of reality, but it's actually to dissolve the conditions under which reality can be known or spoken about at all. And this is where Deleuze in difference and repetition goes wrong, and he doesn't actually understand the Thomistic Aristotelian Platonic understanding of what is going on here, because Deleuze insists that pure difference is ontologically primitive, in that identity is merely derived or is secondary, and it's imposed, as a category, a kind of representational veneer laid over the more fundamental flux of differentiation. Being itself, he argues, is said of difference rather than of identity. The tradition in this reading has illegitimately subordinated difference to the identical, and thus produced a philosophy of mere representation rather than genuine thought. But if you read the commentary on De Anima, it shows that this kind of false dichotomy and misreading of what the tradition actually claimed. Neither Plato nor Aristotle nor Aquinas, right, treated identity as primitive in the sense that Deleuze attacks. Identity and difference were always core principles. They were joint conditions of intelligibility. They weren't things that were competing with one another. And Aquinas, following Aristotle, holds that any real being is simultaneously determinate in itself, right, idem, and distinguished from others, diversium. And these aren't just stages in the dialectic or the levels in a hierarchy, right, they're simultaneously structures or features of being as knowable. Now, what Deleuze is actually attacking then is not Aristotle or Aquinas, but a caricature, a picture of a very naive substance ontology in which things sit there self-identical with difference applied externally between them. And that picture bears no resemblance at all to the actual Thomistic Aristotelian Platonic framework, where identity is always kind of a participated thing, a relational thing through analogia entis. It's never brute, it's never self-grounding. Right? A being is what it is, only within a web of relations to other beings, and ultimately to pure act of esse in God. So the problem is that Deleuze's own position requires what it denies. To say that being is said of difference is to say something is to make a determinate claim, with a specific content that rules out alternative positions. That very act of saying presupposes the co-presence of identity and difference that Aquinas following Plato and Aristotle found irreducible. Deleuze needs identity in order to assert the primacy of difference. He does not understand that the tradition he opposes already knew this, and they built it down from the beginning. Thank you for watching, and peace.